The evening draped Savannah in a velvet cloak of indigo and violet, the city's historic charm glowing under the soft flicker of streetlights. Inside the grand old house on Abercorn Street, where time seemed to linger in the creak of polished floors and the chime of antique clocks, Clara sat alone in the guest room. The faint hum of cicadas drifted through the open window, mingling with the distant notes of a jazz quartet playing in a nearby square. At 32, Clara was a freelance photographer, her life a mosaic of fleeting moments captured through her lens. But tonight, her camera sat untouched on the dresser, and her thoughts were far from art. She glanced at her phone. No messages from Michael, her husband of 5 years, who was halfway across the country on a business trip. His insistence that she stay with his parents while he was away had left her uneasy, a subtle command cloaked in concern. "It'll be good for them to have you around," he'd said, oblivious to the weight his words carried. Clara had agreed not out of duty, but because arguing felt like shouting into a void. Now in this house of high ceilings and heavy silences, she felt like an intruder in a story that wasn't hers. Downstairs, the living room was bathed in the warm glow of a single lamp. Clara descended the staircase, her bare feet silent on the cool hardwood, drawn by a restless need she couldn't name. The house was still, save for the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. As she passed the living room, she saw him. Henry, her father-in-law, seated in a leather armchair, a glass of bourbon cradled in his hand. At 64, Henry was a retired literature professor, his silver hair and sharp blue eyes lending him an air of quiet authority. He stared into the unlit fireplace, his expression distant, as if chasing ghosts in the shadows. "Can't sleep." Clara's voice was a soft ripple in the stillness. Henry's gaze flickered to her, his lips curving into a faint, wistful smile. "Sleep's a shy guest tonight," he murmured, his voice low and rich, like the bourbon in his glass. He didn't invite her to sit, but he didn't turn her away either. Clara hesitated, then settled onto the edge of the sofa, leaving a careful distance between them. Her silk nightgown, a deep emerald that clung to her curves, shimmered faintly in the lamplight. "Does the quiet unsettle you?" Henry asked, his eyes still on the fireplace. "No," Clara replied, surprised by her own candor. "It's like the house is whispering its secrets when no one's talking." For the first time, Henry turned to look at her. Really look at her. His gaze was slow, deliberate, peeling back layers she hadn't realized she'd hidden. "You hear things most people miss," he said, not as a compliment, but as a quiet truth. Clara felt a flush creep up her neck, her pulse quickening under his scrutiny. "And what do you hear in this silence?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry swirled the bourbon in his glass, his eyes darkening. "Things I've kept locked away too long," he said, his tone heavy with unspoken confessions. The air between them thickened, charged with a current neither could name. Clara's breath caught her fingers, tightening around the hem of her nightgown. She should leave retreat to the safety of her room, but her body refused to move. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, electric, pulling them into a space where words felt unnecessary. Nothing more was said that night. Clara rose her glass of water forgotten on the table and climbed the stairs with her heart pounding. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlit garden beyond the window. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a crack in a foundation no one could see. The next morning, sunlight poured into the dining room where Clara Henry and Margaret Henry's wife shared breakfast. Margaret, a gentle woman of 62 with a passion for painting, chatted about her latest watercolor and the roses in her garden. Henry sipped his coffee, his responses polite but distant, his eyes occasionally meeting Clara's with a flicker of something unspoken. Clara smiled, nodded, played the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law, but inside her thoughts were a storm. Every glance from Henry felt like a brushstroke on a canvas she hadn't meant to paint. The day unfolded with deceptive normalcy. They strolled through Savannah's historic squares, the moss-draped oaks casting dappled shadows on the cobblestones, They laughed over lunch on the patio, the clink of glasses, and Margaret's stories filling the air. But beneath the surface, Clara felt Henry's presence, like a pulse, steady, insistent, drawing her in. When their hands brushed, while reaching for the same pitcher of iced tea, the contact sent a jolt through her, and she caught the brief, unguarded intensity in his eyes before he looked away. That afternoon, Margaret left to visit a friend, her absence leaving the house quieter, heavier. Clara was in the kitchen steeping chamomile tea when she saw Henry pass by, a leather-bound book in hand, heading toward his study. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he knew she was watching. Without thinking, Clara followed her bare feet, silent on the floor. The study door was ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hall. She knocked softly. "Come in," Henry said, his voice calm, but laced with something deeper. Clara stepped inside the room, enveloping her in the scent of aged paper and polished wood. Henry sat behind his desk, the book open before him, but his eyes were on her. She sank into the armchair across from him, her silk skirt riding up slightly, revealing the smooth curve of her thigh. She didn't adjust it. "Reading something good?" she asked, her voice light, but her heart was racing. Henry closed the book, his fingers lingering on the cover. "It used to hold me," he said. "But lately I find people more compelling." His words were measured, but they landed like a spark on dry tinder. Clara's breath hitched. "You don't like being alone." Sometimes, he said, his gaze locking with hers. "But not lately. Lately I've realized silence doesn't always soothe." The question came before she could stop it. "And me? Do you think I'm happy with Michael?" Henry's eyes softened, but there was a sharpness beneath. "Are you?" The honesty slipped out raw and unfiltered. "Not always." Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "Sometimes it feels like we're strangers sharing a life out of habit." Henry nodded as if he'd known the answer before she spoke. "That's the tragedy of some lives," he said. "The question is, do you dare to change it?" He stood, crossing to a side table where a teapot sat. He poured a cup and offered it to her, their fingers brushing as she took it. The touch lingered, a silent agreement that neither acknowledged. They talked for hours about art, literature, the choices that shape a life. There were no overt gestures, no declarations, but the air between them hummed with possibility. When Clara leaned forward to set her cup on the desk, their hands brushed again, and this time neither pulled away. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a permission, a promise. Clara left the study with her body buzzing, her mind replaying the touch, the look, the weight of what hadn't been said. The next day was a dance of near misses and stolen glances. In the kitchen, their shoulders brushed as they reached for the same jar of honey. In the garden, they paused over the same blooming jasmine, their fingers grazing as they touched the petals. Each moment was a spark building towards something inevitable. That night, with Margaret asleep upstairs, Clara stood in the living room, arranging books on a shelf. Henry appeared in the doorway, his presence a quiet command. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," Clara said, but she didn't move. She felt him step closer, his warmth radiating behind her, close enough to feel, but not to touch. "This isn't right," he said, his voice strained with restraint. "I know," Clara whispered, turning to face him, "but I don't want to pretend it's not there." Their eyes locked, and the distance between them vanished. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a meeting of souls rather than bodies. It was deep, unhurried, filled with a tenderness that made Clara's chest ache. When it ended, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the quiet. "This can't happen again," Clara said, the words a fragile shield. "I know," Henry replied, but his voice held no conviction. They parted, retreating to their separate rooms. Clara sat on her bed, her body trembling, her mind alive, with the memory of his lips, his touch. She didn't cry or regret. She simply understood that some moments rewrite you, and this was one of them. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. The house resumed its serene rhythm breakfasts with fresh peaches and cream. Margaret's soft laughter, the hum of classical music from the kitchen radio. Clara and Henry moved through their roles with practiced ease, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Every glance carried a hidden weight. Every casual touch, a brush of fingers passing a plate, a hand grazing a shoulder, felt like a secret shared in plain sight. Clara noticed the way Henry's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She caught herself watching him too, the way his hands moved when he turned the pages of his book, the faint smile that curved his lips when he listened to her talk about her photography. The tension between them was a living thing coiled and waiting, but neither dared to act on it again. On the 5th night with Margaret at a book club meeting, Clara found herself in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, the fire crackling softly. She wore a fitted black dress, the neckline low enough to hint at the curve of her breasts, the hem short enough to reveal the long line of her legs. She hadn't planned to dress this way, but the choice felt deliberate, a quiet rebellion against the restraint she'd imposed on herself. Henry appeared in the doorway, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the lean strength of his forearms. He paused, his eyes sweeping over her, a flicker of desire breaking through his usual composure. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low. Clara's pulse quickened. "Not at all," she said, gesturing to the armchair across from her. He sat pouring himself a glass of bourbon from the decanter on the table. The silence between them was heavy, charged with the memory of their kiss. Clara sipped her wine, her lips lingering on the rim of the glass, her eyes never leaving his. "You look different tonight," Henry said, his voice careful, but laced with something darker. "Do I?" Clara replied, her tone teasing. She uncrossed her legs slowly, letting the hem of her dress ride up just enough to draw his gaze. His eyes flickered down, then back to her face, his jaw tightening. "You know you do," he said, his voice rougher now. Clara leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her cleavage subtly accentuated. "And what do you see when you look at me, Henry?" He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Someone who's more alive than she lets on," he said. "Someone who's been hiding." The words hit her, like a spark igniting something reckless inside her. She stood crossing the room to stand before him, close enough for him to feel the heat of her body. "And what if I don't want to hide anymore?" she whispered, her voice trembling with daring. Henry's breath hitched, his eyes dark with conflict. "Clara, we can't." But she didn't let him finish. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her hand rested lightly on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. For a moment, he was still his restraint, a fragile thread. Then his hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and the thread snapped. Their kiss was hungrier this time, a collision of need and surrender. Clara straddled his lap, her dress riding up as his hands roamed her thighs, her back, her hair. His touch was confident, reverent, as if he were memorizing every curve. She guided his hands, showing him where she wanted to be touched, her breath hitching as his fingers traced the edge of her lace underwear. "Like this," she murmured, her voice a sultry command. Henry followed her lead, his movements growing bolder, his lips trailing along her neck, her collarbone the swell of her breasts. The firelight cast their shadows on the wall, a dance of silhouettes that spoke what their words couldn't. Clara's hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, revealing the lean planes of his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his body with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate, each touch a conversation, each kiss a confession. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Clara rested her forehead against his, her hands still tangled in his hair. "This doesn't change anything," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "It changes everything." Henry replied, his voice raw with truth. They didn't go further that night. Clara slipped back to her room, her body humming with the aftershocks of their encounter, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and exhilaration. She lay awake, replaying every moment, knowing they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Michael returned on Friday, his arrival a jarring intrusion into the world Clara and Henry had built. He greeted her with a perfunctory kiss, his stories of meetings and clients filling the air like static. Clara hugged him, her arms mechanical, her heart elsewhere. There were no signs, no suspicions. Michael was too absorbed in his own world to notice the shift in hers. On Sunday, Clara prepared to leave. Margaret hugged her, warmly oblivious to the undercurrents that had reshaped the week. Henry shook her hand, his grip firm, his eyes holding hers for a moment too long. "Take care, Clara," he said, his voice steady, but laced with something only she could hear. "You too," she replied, her fingers lingering in his before she pulled away. As she drove away, the house fading in her rearview mirror, Clara didn't cry or judge herself. She carried the memory of that week like a secret flame, one that warmed her even as it burned. It wasn't infidelity, not in the way people think. It was recognition, a fleeting, miraculous moment where two souls met, understood, and let go without breaking. Back in her own life, Clara resumed her routine, but she was different. She saw the world through a sharper lens, her photographs capturing emotions she'd once ignored. When she thought of Henry, it wasn't with regret, but with gratitude for the awakening he'd given her. Sometimes love doesn't destroy, it illuminates. And when it happens in the quiet spaces, it hurts, but it also heals. Clara didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing she'd never forget, what it felt like to be truly, completely alive. So what would you do if someone made you feel in seconds what you'd waited years for? Where does infidelity begin when the heart has already left? Was this a mistake or a necessary act of humanity between two people who found each other when they needed it most? Share your thoughts and let's explore the messy, beautiful truth of what it means to be human.